And on a previous story, to be a little clearer on the importance of an agreement, we've connected with Theo Balve, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Colgate University in New York State. Good day, Professor Balve. Firstly, can you explain the significance of this agreement on transitional justice?
Sure. Well, it's a groundbreaking agreement because the
Negotiations have been
negotiations
going for 3 years now. It's more than half century of armed conflict, and the transitional justice agreement, out of all the points, was really the one that had really dragged the talks on for a long time now. It's one of the prickliest issues. Basically, the question that was being sorted out by the parties was, what kind of justice system are we going to have in place for both sides, both perpetrators from both sides, when we do come to an agreement? What kind of juridical process are we going to go through to ensure that that the peace is long lasting? And so the fact that they clinched this last sort of piece of the puzzle makes the talks irreversible. The successful outcome of the talks, at least, irreversible. And so they announced that within 6 months they will finally sort out the final details and sign an agreement ending what has been Latin America's longest-running civil war.
And the reparation of the victims was one of the most contentious points of agreement. It was finally reached, but how is this going to pan out? Who's going to be considered a victim?
Well, that's one of the big
questions that this new tribunal is going to have to sort out, because at the beginning of the talks, the two parties weren't even speaking the same language. The FARC said agrarian reform and the government said rural development. In the case of victims, it was much the same sort of talking at cross purposes. The FARC very much considered themselves victims of state terror for more than 40 years. A lot of people in Colombia consider themselves victims of the FARC. And there's also a long history of abuses by the military, and the military says, we are not victimizers, we are the ones protecting democracy. So clearly there's a big disconnect between all these positions, and that's the piece that's not really clear, is exactly what the kinds of reparations are going to be. They've been talking about restorative justice in the sense of the FARC wouldn't necessarily serve prison sentences, but would be the term being used in the agreement so far is they would be deprived of certain liberties, but it's not clear which ones. And the kind of work that they would do would be more sort of restorative work with victims, demining, in terms of also eradicating coca crops as well. Presumably, the Colombian military would be subject to those same sorts of provisions. But I think in these last 6 months is when they're really going to try to iron out the details, and obviously, sometimes that's where the devil's at. So we'll see what happens.
Professor Balve, let's take you to the next point. The FARC agreed to lay down its weapons within 2 months after the deadline, but it didn't agree to deliver them. How is this exactly going to work, and who is going to supervise this?
Again, the details are still vague in terms of how that's going to actually work in practice, and this was one of the things that was sort of always going to be sort of left towards the end. Once you sort everything else out, you can begin to talk about, well, what is the final stages actually going to look like? But the details on this are also scant at this moment. Clearly, the FARC has a lot of concerns about their transition into civilian political life, because they have always been on the receiving end of paramilitary and military repression every time they've tried to make a transition into civilian life. And they have done so always.
Apologies, we seem to have lost Dr. Balve. We will try to get him at another point in time.